Part 1, Dust Storm and Betrayal. The dust storm rolled into Cedar Falls like God's own wrath, turning the sky the color of old copper and coating everything in a fine layer of grit that tasted of broken dreams. Maybelle Carter pressed her face against the warped glass window of McKinnon's saloon, watching the tumbleweeds dance down Main Street like drunken spirits. The wind howled through the gaps in the weathered wooden buildings, carrying with it the scent of sage and something darker, the smell of desperation that seemed to cling to this godforsaken corner of New Mexico territory. At 17, Maybelle had seen enough of desperation to last 3 lifetimes. Her hand instinctively moved to rest on the gentle swell beneath her faded calico dress. 5 months along now, though she'd taken to wearing her late mother's shawl draped loose to hide what couldn't be hidden much longer. The baby stirred as if sensing her distress, and she closed her eyes, whispering a prayer that had become as familiar as breathing. Please, Lord, let there be another way. But there wouldn't be another way, not with Pa the way he was. Maybelle, get yourself over here, girl. Her father's voice cut through the saloon's din like a rusty blade. Thomas Carter stood hunched over a corner table, his once proud shoulders now permanently stooped from years of hauling freight and drowning his sorrows in McKinnon's cheapest whiskey. His graying beard was stained with tobacco juice, and his eyes, once the same clear blue as her own, had taken on the glassy, desperate look of a man who'd gambled away everything decent about himself. She moved toward him slowly, her worn boots silent on the sawdust-covered floor. The saloon reeked of unwashed bodies, stale beer, and broken promises. A piano player in the corner pecked out a melancholy tune, his fingers missing more keys than they hit, while painted women with hollow eyes served drinks to men who'd forgotten what hope looked like. Pa? Her voice came out smaller than she'd intended. Thomas didn't look up from the table where 2 strangers sat studying her with the calculating eyes of men who dealt in human misery. One was thin as a fence post with a pencil mustache that didn't quite hide his cruel mouth. The other was broader, with hands like ham hocks and a gold tooth that caught the lamplight when he smiled, which he did now, looking her up and down like she was livestock. "And this here's my daughter," Thomas said, his words slurring together. "Just like I told you, young, healthy, and—" He gestured vaguely at her condition. "Already proven fertile." Maybelle's stomach turned to ice. "Pa, what are you—" "Hush, now." He finally looked at her, and what she saw there broke something inside her chest that would never quite heal right. There was no love left in those eyes. No recognition of the little girl who'd once braided wildflowers in her hair while he taught her to read from the family Bible. There was only calculation and the cold hunger of a man drowning in debt. These gentlemen here, they're in the business of providing opportunities for young women in difficult circumstances. The thin man spoke for the first time, his voice smooth as snake oil. Mr. Jameson's establishment in Redemption provides room, board, and steady work for ladies who find themselves in need of a fresh start. His eyes lingered on her belly. Children are welcomed, of course, though they do tend to complicate a working woman's earning potential. Maybelle understood then with the sharp clarity that comes with mortal terror. She'd heard whispers about places like Jameson's, about women who went in and never came out the same, if they came out at all. Her hands began to shake. "Pa, please." The words tumbled out in a desperate rush. "I know I've brought shame on our name. I know I've been a burden since Ma died, but please don't do this. I'll work harder. I'll find another way to help with your debts. Your debts?" Thomas's laugh was bitter as alkali water. "Girl, I owe these men's associates more money than you could earn in 10 lifetimes of honest work. And honest work, He gestured at her condition again. Well, that ship sailed the night you spread your legs for that no-good drifter. The words hit her like physical blows. She told him the truth about Jesse Kane, how the smooth-talking gunslinger had sweet-talked her with promises of marriage and a better life, how he'd disappeared the morning she'd worked up the courage to tell him about the baby. But Thomas had chosen to see only the shame, never the heartbreak or the fear. The arrangement is simple, the broader man said, pulling out a leather pouch that clinked with the sound of silver dollars. We provide immediate relief of your financial obligations, say $200 to start, and in return, your daughter begins her new life tomorrow morning. She'll be well cared for, I assure you. We're well cared for? Maybelle's voice cracked like a whip. You mean imprisoned, used, Pa? These men are slavers, nothing more. Thomas's hand moved faster than she'd seen him move in years, catching her across the cheek with enough force to snap her head sideways. The saloon seemed to pause for a heartbeat, conversations dying mid-sentence as heads turned their way. Here, you watch your tongue, he hissed. You lost the right to have opinions the night you chose to act like a whore. Tears stung her eyes, but she blinked them back. She wouldn't give these vultures the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Ma would be ashamed of you, she whispered. Something flickered in Thomas's eyes. Pain. Maybe. Or the ghost of the man he'd once been. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by the dull hatred of a man who'd sold his soul by inches and blamed everyone but himself for the price. Your mother's dead, he said simply, and the dead don't get to judge the living. The thin man cleared his throat delicately. Perhaps we could conclude our business? The storm seems to be worsening, and we have a schedule to maintain. Maybelle looked around the saloon desperately, searching for a friendly face, anyone who might intervene. But the other patrons had already turned away, suddenly fascinated by their drinks or their cards. In a place like Cedar Falls, survival meant minding your own business, and a man's right to dispose of his property, even if that property was his own daughter, was sacred. $200, the broad man repeated, placing the pouch on the table where the silver caught the lamplight like 30 pieces of Judas money. Final offer? Thomas reached for the pouch with hands that trembled, whether from drink or the magnitude of what he was doing. Maybelle couldn't tell. It's done then, he said, not meeting her eyes. She's yours. The words hit her like a physical blow. She watched her father, the man who'd once carried her on his shoulders to see the 4th of July fireworks, who'd read her stories from the Bible every night after Ma died, count the silver coins with the same careful attention he'd once reserved for teaching her to cipher and write. Outside, the wind howled like all the demons of hell, and Maybelle Carter realized that sometimes the real monsters wore familiar faces. Part 2. The stranger's arrival. The saloon doors burst open with such force that one hinge gave way entirely, sending the weathered wood panel clattering against the wall like a gunshot. Every conversation died mid-word as the dust storm seemed to follow the stranger inside, swirling around his boots in golden eddies that caught the lamplight. He stood silhouetted in the doorway for a moment that stretched like eternity, his broad frame filling the space completely. The wind whipped his long coat around his legs, and dust clung to every inch of him, from the brim of his black hat pulled low over his eyes to the worn leather of his boots. When he stepped inside, his spurs rang against the floorboards with the measured cadence of a funeral bell. Maybelle felt her breath catch in her throat. There was something about this man that commanded attention, not just his size, though he stood well over 6 feet, but the way he carried himself, like a predator who'd never learned to be prey. The stranger's eyes swept the room with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to cataloging threats and exits. When his gaze fell on their table, It lingered for a heartbeat longer than necessary. Maybelle couldn't make out his features clearly beneath the shadow of his hat brim, but she felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing. "McKinnon," the stranger said, his voice carrying easily over the wind that still howled through the broken door. "Heard you might have a room for the night." Seamus McKinnon, the saloon owner, was already hurrying forward with a rag to wipe dust from his hands. "Course, Mr. Boone." The stranger didn't offer a first name. Caleb Boone. The thin man at Maybelle's table, who'd introduced himself as Silas Webb, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His partner, the broad one called Dutch Morrison, had gone very still, his ham-like hands resting flat on the table. "Know that name," Dutch muttered under his breath, though whether to Webb or himself Maybelle couldn't tell. Caleb Boone moved toward the bar with the fluid grace of a man comfortable in his own skin. But his path took him close enough to their table that Maybelle caught a glimpse of his profile. His face was weathered like old leather, with lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into sun and wind. A jagged scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, and his mouth was set in a hard line that suggested smiling wasn't a frequent occurrence. But it was his eyes that made her heart skip. They were gray as storm clouds and just as turbulent, holding depths that spoke of violence witnessed and violence done. When they fixed on her for a brief moment, she felt stripped bare, as if he could see straight through to her soul. "Let go of the girl." The words were spoken quietly, almost conversationally, but they cut through the saloon's atmosphere like a blade through silk. Every head in the place turned toward their table. Thomas looked up from counting his silver, confusion creasing his weathered features. "I beg your pardon?" Caleb had stopped beside their table, close enough that Maybelle could smell dust and leather and something else. Gunpowder, maybe, or the metallic scent of danger. His right hand hung loose at his side, fingers curved in a way that spoke of long familiarity with the Colt .45 holstered at his hip. "Said let go of the girl." His voice remained level, almost pleasant. "Don't make me repeat myself a third time." Webb's hand moved toward his jacket, but froze when Caleb's gray eyes shifted to him. "Wouldn't, if I were you. This doesn't concern you, gentlemen, and I'd hate for you to make it concern you. Now see here," Thomas blustered, rising unsteadily to his feet. "This is a private business transaction between myself and these men. You got no right to—" "I got every right." Caleb's gaze never wavered. "See, I know exactly what kind of business transaction this is, and I know exactly what kind of men these are." He tilted his head slightly toward Webb and Morrison. "Question is, do you?" Morrison finally spoke, his voice tight with barely controlled tension. "This ain't your concern, Boone. Walk away while you still can." Caleb's mouth curved in what might have been a smile if there'd been any warmth in it. "Dutch Morrison. Should have known. Last I heard, you were running girls out of El Paso before the Rangers convinced you to find a new line of work. That was years ago," Morrison growled. "I'm in legitimate business now." "Legitimate?" Caleb seemed to taste the word. "That what you're calling it these days?" The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Maybelle could feel her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched the three men size each other up like wolves deciding whether to fight or flee. Around them, the other patrons were quietly backing away from the table, some slipping out through the broken door into the storm. "The girl is my daughter," Thomas said, trying to inject authority into his voice. "I got the right to—" "To sell her?" Caleb's attention snapped back to him with laser intensity. "That what you call fatherly love these days?" Thomas's face flushed red above his beard. "She brought shame on our family. She's carrying a bastard child, and I can't afford to keep feeding her when—" The rest of his words were cut off as Caleb moved faster than Maybelle would have thought possible for a man his size. One moment he was standing beside the table. The next his hand was twisted in Thomas's shirt, hauling him up onto his toes. "Careful what you say next, old man," Caleb said, his voice soft as silk and twice as dangerous. "Because if you call your own daughter that word again, I'm going to forget I was trying to be reasonable." Thomas's eyes widened as he found himself staring into the face of a man who'd clearly killed before and wouldn't lose sleep over doing it again. I just meant, I know what you meant." Caleb released him so suddenly that Thomas stumbled backward, nearly falling into his chair. "Question is, what are you going to do about it?" Webb's hand was inching toward his jacket again, and this time Caleb let him get halfway there before moving. The sound of his Colt clearing leather was like thunder in the confined space, and suddenly Webb was staring down the barrel of the deadliest-looking pistol Maybelle had ever seen. "Told you not to make this concern you," Caleb said mildly. Morrison was reaching for his own gun when Caleb's left hand, moving independently of his right, caught the big man's wrist and twisted. The sound of bones grinding together was audible even over the wind, and Morrison's cry of pain was cut short as Caleb's elbow drove into his solar plexus. The whole thing was over in seconds. Morrison was doubled over, clutching his broken wrist and gasping for air. Webb sat frozen with his hand still halfway to his jacket, staring at the Colt that hadn't wavered so much as an inch from the center of his forehead. "Now then," Caleb said, as if nothing had happened. "Where were we?" You can't just," Thomas stammered. "Can't what? Prevent a crime? Because that's what this is, old man. What you're doing to that girl is a crime against nature and God both." Caleb reached into his coat with his free hand and pulled out a leather pouch that clinked with the sound of gold coins. He tossed it onto the table where it landed with enough force to scatter Thomas's silver. "There's $300, twice what these vultures were offering." Thomas stared at the pouch like it might bite him. What do you want for it?" "Consider it a purchase," Caleb said, his gray eyes finding Maybelle's across the table. "Told you to let go of the girl. This way. We're both getting what we want. You can't buy a person." Maybelle found her voice at last, the words bursting out before she could stop them. "I'm not property to be traded between men like a horse or a cow," for the first time since he'd entered the saloon. Caleb's expression shifted. Something that might have been approval flickered in his storm-gray eyes. "No, you're not," he agreed. "But your father here seems to think otherwise. So I'm playing by his rules." He turned back to Thomas, who was still staring at the gold with hungry eyes. "Take the money and walk away. Forget you ever had a daughter. Shouldn't be too hard. You were doing a fine job of it already." "And if I refuse?" Thomas asked, though his hand was already moving toward the pouch. Caleb's smile was colder than a winter grave. "Then I kill you where you stand and take her anyway. Your choice." The words were spoken with such casual matter-of-factness that Maybelle felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't a bluff or an idle threat. This man would do exactly what he said without a moment's hesitation. Thomas grabbed the pouch with shaking hands, not bothering to count the contents. She's yours then," he mumbled, already backing toward the door. "Wait," Maybelle called after him, but Thomas didn't look back. Within moments, he disappeared into the storm, leaving her alone with 3 men who all had their own reasons for wanting to own her. Caleb holstered his Colt with practiced ease and turned to Webb and Morrison. "You boys best be moving along. Storm's getting worse, and you wouldn't want to get caught out in it." Webb was already rising from his chair, his face pale as parchment. Morrison followed, still cradling his broken wrist against his chest. "This ain't over, Boone," Morrison growled as they headed for the door. "Course it is," Caleb replied mildly. "Just like your business in this territory. I see either of you within 50 miles of here again, and we'll finish what we started tonight." When they were gone, the saloon seemed to exhale collectively. Conversation slowly resumed, though they were muted and nervous. McKinnon busied himself cleaning glasses that were already clean, pointedly not looking at their table. Caleb turned to face Maybelle fully for the first time, and she felt her breath catch. Up close, he was even more imposing and more dangerous than she'd realized. But there was something else in his eyes now. Something that might have been gentleness if she hadn't known better. "Well then, miss," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Reckon we should be going." "Going where?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. His smile was enigmatic. "Somewhere safe. Somewhere those men can't follow." He gestured toward the storm still raging outside. "But first, we wait for this to blow over. No sense riding out in weather like this if we don't have to." Maybelle looked around the saloon, at the faces carefully not looking their way, at the broken door still banging in the wind, at the table where her father had just sold her like cattle. When she looked back at Caleb Boone, she realized she had no choice but to trust him. After all, what other choice did she have? Part 3. On horseback, leaving town. The storm had blown itself out some time before dawn, leaving Cedar Falls looking like a town carved from sand and silence. Maybelle stood in the doorway of McKinnon's saloon, clutching her mother's worn shawl around her shoulders as she watched Caleb Boone check the cinches on his horse, a massive bay stallion that looked like it could outrun the devil himself. The horse was as intimidating as its owner. Standing nearly 17 hands high with intelligent dark eyes that seemed to take her measure. Steam rose from its nostrils in the cool morning air, and when it shifted its weight, the leather of the saddle creaked like old bones. "You ever ridden before?" Caleb asked without looking up from his work. His voice carried easily in the still air, though he spoke barely above a murmur. "Some," Maybelle replied, though the truth was she'd only been on horseback a handful of times, and never anything larger than old Mrs. Henderson's gentle mare. "My pa used to have a horse, but he sold it 3 winters back," Caleb grunted, which she was learning seemed to be his standard response to most everything. He'd spoken perhaps 20 words to her since the confrontation last night, spending the dark hours sitting in a chair by the window with his hat pulled low and his hand resting on his gun. She'd managed to doze fitfully on a bench near the cold fireplace, but every time she'd stirred, she'd seen him there, watching, waiting, ready. Now, in the pale light of morning, she could see him more clearly. He was older than she'd first thought, probably nearing 40, with silver threading through the dark hair at his temples. His clothes were well made but worn, the kind of gear a man wore when he spent more time in the saddle than in civilization. Everything about him spoke of competence and danger in equal measure. "Where exactly are we going?" she asked as he untied his saddlebags and began rearranging their contents. "Away from here." He pulled out a bundle wrapped in oiled cloth and handed it to her. "Jerky and hardtack. Eat some now, we won't be stopping for a while." The food was tough and salty, but her stomach had been empty since yesterday afternoon, and she was grateful for anything. The baby seemed grateful too, settling into a less restless rhythm as she ate. "That's not an answer," she said between bites. Caleb finally looked at her directly, those storm-gray eyes unreadable in the morning light. "It's the only answer you're getting for now." "Why?" The word came out sharper than she'd intended, but she was tired of being pushed around by men who thought they knew what was best for her. You bought me from my father like I was livestock, and now you won't even tell me where you're taking me? How is that any different from what those other men were doing? Something flickered across his features. Surprise, maybe, or approval. You got spirit. That's good. You're going to need it. That's still not an answer. He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with an intensity that made her want to look away. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, though no less serious. Those men would have used you up and thrown you away inside a year. What I'm offering is different. What exactly are you offering? Safety, protection, a chance for you and your child to survive what's coming. What's coming? But he'd already turned back to his horse, effectively ending the conversation. Maybelle felt frustration rise in her chest like floodwater. Every man she'd ever known, her father, Jesse Kane, and now this stranger, seemed to think she was too fragile or too stupid to handle the truth. I'm not a child, she said, loud enough that a few early risers on the street turned to look. I'm 17 years old. I'm carrying a baby, and my father just sold me to prevent his own skin from being stretched over gambling debts. I think I've earned the right to know what I'm walking into. Caleb paused with one foot in the stirrup, his back still to her. You want the truth? Yes. The truth is that you're in more danger than you know. The truth is that those men last night weren't just buying another girl for their business. They were specifically looking for you. The truth is that your baby's father isn't the small-time drifter you think he is, and the people he runs with would kill you and cut that child out of your belly if they thought it would serve their purposes. The words hit her like physical blows, leaving her breathless and shaking. You're lying. Am I? He swung into the saddle with fluid grace, looking down at her from what felt like a great height. Jesse Kane ring any bells? Smooth talker? Quick with a gun? Rides with Dutch Morrison's old crew when he's not charming girls out of their virtue? Maybelle's legs suddenly felt weak. She told no one Jesse's full name, not her father, not anyone. How do you, know about him? Same way I knew what Morrison and Webb were really after. Same way I know you're carrying more than just an innocent child. His voice was flat, matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the weather. Question is, what are you going to do about it? She stared up at him, her mind reeling. Everything she thought she knew about her situation was crumbling like a house built on sand. I don't understand. You don't have to, not yet. He extended his hand down to her. But you do have to choose. Come with me now, or stay here and wait for Morrison's friends to come back, because they will come back, and next time they won't be interested in paying your father for the privilege. The morning sun was climbing higher, painting the dusty street in shades of gold and amber. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell was ringing, probably calling the faithful to Sunday services, she realized. People would be gathering to sing hymns and pray for salvation, while she stood in the street being asked to trust her life to a man who spoke of violence as casually as others discussed the weather. But what choice did she have? Her father was gone, disappeared into the morning like smoke. She had no money, no friends, no family willing to take her in. And if what Caleb was saying about Jesse and the baby was true, she took his hand. His grip was strong and sure as he pulled her up behind him, settling her sideways on the horse's broad back. The stallion shifted under their combined weight but held steady, responding to some subtle signal from Caleb that she hadn't even seen. "Oh, hold tight," he said. And she wrapped her arms around his waist, feeling the solid warmth of him through his coat. He smelled of leather and dust and something else, something clean and male that made her uncomfortably aware of how close they were sitting. The horse moved out at an easy walk, carrying them down Main Street past the few businesses that made up Cedar Falls commercial district. Maybelle saw Mrs. Garrett hanging wash in her yard, and old Mr. Pendleton sweeping his porch, and felt a pang of something that might have been homesickness if this place had ever truly felt like home. They rode in silence until the town was nothing but a smudge on the horizon behind them. The landscape around them was harsh and beautiful, rolling hills covered in sage and juniper, broken by occasional stands of cottonwood that marked the presence of water. The sky stretched endlessly overhead, blue as her mother's best china and twice as fragile-looking. "Where are we going?" she asked again, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "North," he said, which was barely more helpful than his previous non-answers. "How far north?" "Far enough." She was quiet for a while, watching the country roll past and trying to process everything that had happened in the last 12 hours. Her whole life had been turned upside down, and she still didn't understand why. "Tell me about Jesse," she said finally. Caleb's back stiffened slightly. "What do you want to know?" "Everything. If what you're saying is true, if I'm really in danger because of him, then I need to know what I'm dealing with." He was quiet for so long she thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "Jesse Kane is a gun for hire. He rides with a gang that specializes in robbery, extortion, and worse. They've got operations running from here to California, and they don't leave loose ends. You think I'm a loose end? I think you're carrying Jesse Kane's child, and that makes you valuable to the wrong people." "Valuable how?" Another long silence. The horse's hooves made a steady rhythm on the packed earth, and somewhere overhead a hawk circled lazily on thermal currents. "There are things you don't know," Caleb said finally. "Things about what Jesse and his crew have been up to. Things that could get a lot of people hanged if they came to light." "What kind of things?" "The kind that make a pregnant girl a powerful bargaining chip." The implications of his words settled over her like a cold fog. She thought about Jesse's easy smile, his smooth words, the way he'd made her feel like she was the most important thing in the world. Had any of it been real? Or had she been nothing more than a mark from the very beginning? "How do you know all this?" she asked. "I know because it's my business to know." "What business is that?" When he turned his head slightly, she caught a glimpse of his profile, the hard line of his jaw, the scar that ran down his cheek like a white river through sun-weathered stone. "The kind that keeps people like you alive." It wasn't a complete answer, but something in his tone warned her not to push. They rode on in silence as the sun climbed higher and the heat began to build. The baby stirred restlessly, and Maybelle shifted position, trying to find a more comfortable way to sit. "There's a stream about an hour ahead," Caleb said, apparently sensing her discomfort. "We'll stop there, let the horse rest and get some water." "And then?" "Then we keep riding." She wanted to ask where they were heading, how long it would take to get there, what would happen when they arrived. But she was beginning to understand that Caleb Boone was a man who revealed information on his own terms, and pushing him would only make him close up tighter. So she held her questions and watched the country roll past, trying not to think about the life she was leaving behind or the uncertain future that lay ahead. The only thing she knew for certain was that she was riding toward something that would change everything. Again. And despite her fear, despite her uncertainty about this taciturn stranger who'd bought her freedom with gold and violence, she couldn't quite shake the feeling that for the first time in months, she was finally moving in the right direction, even if she had no idea where that direction would ultimately lead. Part 4. The Hidden Refuge. The canyon opened before them like a secret carved into the earth itself, its red sandstone walls rising on either side like the ribs of some ancient giant. Maybelle had to crane her neck to see the rim, where scrub oak and juniper clung to the rocky edges against a sky that had deepened to the color of old pewter. They'd been riding for 3 days, stopping only to rest the horse and grab a few hours of sleep under the stars. And she was beginning to think Caleb intended to ride straight off the edge of the world. The narrow trail they followed was barely wide enough for the stallion, winding through gaps in the rock that seemed impossible until they were through them. More than once, Maybelle found herself holding her breath as they passed between walls of stone that nearly brushed her knees, the horse's hooves ringing against bare rock with sounds that echoed strangely in the confined space. "How did you ever find this place?" she asked, her voice coming back to her from a dozen different directions. "Wasn't looking for it," Caleb replied, his attention focused on the treacherous path ahead. "Sometimes the best hiding places find you." They emerged from the canyon into a hidden valley that took Maybelle's breath away. It was like stepping into another world, a green oasis tucked away in the heart of the high desert, invisible from any direction unless you knew exactly where to look. A stream ran down the center of the valley, fed by springs that bubbled up from deep in the earth, and cottonwoods lined its banks like sentinels. Grass grew thick and sweet, and she could see the shapes of cattle scattered across the meadowland like dark jewels against the emerald backdrop. But it was the house that made her gasp aloud. It sat on a rise overlooking the stream, built from the same red sandstone as the canyon walls, but fitted together with such skill that it seemed to have grown from the rock itself. It was larger than she'd expected. 2 stories with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides, and windows that caught the afternoon light like friendly eyes. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin gray line, and she could see flower boxes beneath some of the windows, bright with blooms that shouldn't have been able to survive in this harsh country. "Welcome to Sanctuary," Caleb said, and for the first time since she'd met him, there was something almost like warmth in his voice. As they rode closer, Maybelle could see more details that spoke of care and permanence. There was a vegetable garden behind the house, neat rows of green that promised fresh food. A chicken coop sat near the barn, and she could hear the contented clucking of hens. Laundry hung on a line, snapping in the breeze like prayer flags. "Someone lives here," she said, stating the obvious because her mind was still trying to process what she was seeing. "Someone does." He guided the horse toward the barn, a sturdy structure that looked like it could house a dozen animals comfortably. "Her name's Hannah Whitmore. She'll take good care of you." Before Maybelle could ask what he meant by that, the front door of the house opened and a woman stepped onto the porch. She was perhaps 50, with steel gray hair pulled back in a practical bun and a face that spoke of years spent under the sun and wind. She wore a simple brown dress with an apron tied around her waist, and her hands were dusted with what looked like flour. But it was her eyes that captured Maybelle's attention. Warm brown eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. From Maybelle's condition to her travel-stained clothes to the way she sat behind Caleb like she wasn't quite sure she belonged there. "Caleb Boone," the woman called out, her voice carrying easily across the yard. "About time you showed up. I was beginning to think you'd gotten yourself shot full of holes somewhere." "Takes more than bullets to kill me, Hannah," Caleb replied, swinging down from the saddle with his usual fluid grace. "You know that. I know you're too stubborn to die easy, but that doesn't mean I don't worry." Hannah's attention shifted to Maybelle, and her expression softened. "And this must be the young lady you sent word about." "Sent word?" Maybelle looked between them in confusion. "How did you—" "Apache runner," Caleb said simply, as if that explained everything. He reached up to help her down from the horse, his hands strong and sure around her waist. They know these canyons better than anyone, and they owe me a favor or two. Hannah was already moving down the porch steps, her practical boots making no sound on the wooden planks. Up close, Maybelle could see laugh lines around her eyes and a general air of competence that was both comforting and slightly intimidating. "Look at you, child," Hannah said, reaching out to cup Maybelle's face in hands that were work-roughened but gentle. "You look like you haven't had a decent meal in weeks. And those shadows under your eyes." She clicked her tongue disapprovingly. "Come on inside. I've got soup on the stove and biscuits in the oven." "Mrs. Whitmore," Maybelle began, but the older woman waved her off. "Hey, Hannah, just Hannah. And don't you worry about anything right now except getting some food in you and resting those bones. We'll have plenty of time to talk later." Maybelle looked back at Caleb, who was already unsaddling his horse. "Are you coming?" He paused in his work, his hands stilling on the leather. "I'll be along. Got to see to the horse first." Something in his tone made her think he was putting off more than just animal care. But Hannah was already guiding her toward the house with gentle but firm hands. "Men," Hannah said with fond exasperation. "They'll tend to every creature under the sun before they'll tend to themselves. Come on, let's get you settled." The inside of the house was even more impressive than the outside. The main room was spacious and comfortable, with a stone fireplace big enough to roast a whole pig and furniture that looked like it had been built to last centuries. Navajo rugs covered the floor in patterns of red and gold and deep blue, and the walls were lined with books, more books than Maybelle had ever seen in one place. "You like to read?" Hannah asked, noticing her stare. "When I can. My mother taught me before she died, and Pa had a few books, but—" She trailed off, not wanting to explain about her father's gradual descent into drink and gambling. "Well, you'll have plenty of opportunity here. I've got novels and poetry, history and philosophy, even some medical texts." Hannah bustled toward what Maybelle assumed was the kitchen, talking as she moved. "Always believed an educated woman is a dangerous woman, and the world could use more dangerous women." The kitchen was a marvel of efficiency and comfort, with a massive cast-iron stove that radiated warmth and shelves lined with preserves and dried herbs. The smell of soup, something rich and meaty that made Maybelle's stomach clench with hunger, filled the air. "Sit," Hannah commanded, pointing to a chair at a wooden table that could have seated 8 people comfortably. "And don't argue. You look ready to fall over." Maybelle sat gratefully, her legs suddenly feeling like water. The baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly enthusiastic kick, and she winced, one hand moving instinctively to her belly. Hannah noticed immediately. "How far along are you, child?" 5 months, near as I can figure." "And the father?" Maybelle's face flushed hot. "He's not in the picture anymore." Hannah ladled soup into a bowl and set it in front of her along with a thick slice of bread that was still warm from the oven. Men who abandon pregnant women usually aren't worth mourning anyway. The soup was the best thing Maybelle had tasted in months. Rich beef broth with vegetables and barley that seemed to fill the hollow places inside her. She ate with an efficiency that probably wasn't ladylike but couldn't be helped. And Hannah watched with obvious approval. "Better," the older woman said when Maybelle finally came up for air. "Now then, let's talk about what comes next." "I'm not sure I understand." Hannah poured herself a cup of coffee and settled into the chair across from her. "Caleb brought you here for a reason, child. This place, Sanctuary. It's more than just a ranch. It's exactly what the name suggests. A place for people who need to disappear for a while. Disappear from what? Depends on the person. Sometimes it's the law, sometimes it's family, sometimes it's men who think they have a claim on something that was never theirs to begin with. Hannah's brown eyes were steady and knowing. Caleb told me a little about your situation, about your father and those men who wanted to buy you. Maybelle set down her spoon, suddenly less hungry. What exactly did he tell you? Enough to know you're in danger. Enough to know you need a safe place to have that baby and figure out what comes next. Hannah leaned forward, her voice gentle but serious. This valley is hidden, child, protected. The Apache consider it sacred ground, and they make sure unwelcome visitors don't find their way in. You could stay here for years and never see another soul if that's what you chose. And the price for this sanctuary? Maybelle asked, because she'd learned that everything came with a price. Hannah's expression grew thoughtful. Caleb's rules are simple. You work for your keep. Everyone here contributes according to their abilities. You don't bring trouble to the valley. What problems you have, you leave at the canyon mouth, and you don't leave without his permission. The last rule made Maybelle's stomach clench with something that wasn't hunger. So I'm still a prisoner, just in a prettier cage. Are you? Hannah stood and moved to the window that looked out over the valley. Tell me, child, when's the last time you felt truly safe? When's the last time you went to sleep without wondering what fresh hell tomorrow might bring? Maybelle opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again. The truth was, she couldn't remember feeling truly safe since her mother died 3 years ago. Even before her father started drinking heavily. Even before Jesse Kane came into her life with his smooth words and false promises. She'd always felt like she was walking on thin ice, never knowing when it might crack beneath her feet. Caleb's not your father, Hannah continued, still looking out the window. And he's not those men who wanted to buy you like livestock. His rules aren't about controlling you, they're about protecting everyone who lives under his care. And make no mistake, child, once you're here, you are under his care. That means something to a man like Caleb Boone. What kind of man is he? Maybelle asked. Hannah was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was soft with something that might have been old grief. The kind who saves people, even when it costs him more than he can afford. The kind who carries other people's pain like it was his own. The kind who's forgotten how to save himself. Before Maybelle could ask what she meant by that, the front door opened and Caleb stepped inside, his hat in his hands and his boots making soft sounds on the wooden floor. He'd cleaned up somehow. His face was free of trail dust, and he'd changed into a fresh shirt, but he still carried himself with that coiled alertness that seemed to be his natural state. Everything settled? Hannah asked. Horses fed and watered. Sent Jimmy to keep an eye on the canyon mouth. He looked at Maybelle, those gray eyes unreadable. How are you feeling? Confused, she said honestly. Grateful but confused. Something that might have been a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Confusion's normal. Gratitude's optional. Hannah was telling me about your rules. Was she? His attention shifted to the older woman, and Maybelle caught some wordless communication pass between them. And what do you think of them? Maybelle considered her answer carefully. I think I understand why they're necessary. I'm not sure I like them. Fair enough. He moved to the fireplace, resting one hand on the stone mantel. But understand this. Those rules aren't suggestions. They're not open to negotiation or debate. As long as you're in this valley, as long as you're under my protection, you follow them. All of them. No exceptions. The words were spoken quietly, but there was steel underneath them. The same steel she'd heard in his voice when he'd faced down Morrison and Webb in the saloon. This was not a man accustomed to having his authority questioned. And if I don't, then you leave. Tonight. I'll give you a horse and enough supplies to reach the nearest town, and you can take your chances with whatever's waiting for you out there. The choice, when laid out so starkly, wasn't really a choice at all. Maybelle thought about Cedar Falls, about her father counting silver coins while she begged for mercy. She thought about Morrison and Webb and their talk of opportunities and fresh starts. She thought about Jesse Kane and whatever danger his name might bring down on her head. Then she looked around the warm kitchen, at Hannah's kind face and Caleb's watchful eyes, at the promise of safety that felt too good to be true but was being offered anyway. "I'll follow your rules," she said quietly. Caleb nodded once, as if he'd expected no other answer. "Good. Hannah will show you to your room and get you anything you need. We'll talk more tomorrow, once you've had a chance to rest." He was turning toward the door when Maybelle spoke again. "Caleb?" He paused, looking back at her over his shoulder. "Thank you, Gul, for what you did in Cedar Falls, for bringing me here. Thank you." For a moment, his expression softened, and she caught a glimpse of something almost vulnerable in those storm-gray eyes. "Don't thank me yet," he said quietly. "Wait until you see what comes next." Part 5. Secrets and Motives. The morning sun painted the canyon walls in shades of copper and gold, and Maybelle had been awake for hours watching the light creep across her bedroom ceiling. 3 weeks had passed since Caleb brought her to Sanctuary, and she was beginning to understand the rhythm of this hidden place, the way Hannah hummed while she cooked breakfast, the sound of cattle lowing in the distance, the gentle murmur of the stream that never stopped running through the heart of the valley. But it was the things she didn't understand that kept her awake at night, like the way Caleb would disappear for days at a time without explanation, returning with supplies that he claimed came from trading posts, though she'd never seen him take anything to trade, like the Apache who sometimes appeared at the canyon's edge, speaking in low voices with whoever was on watch before melting back into the landscape like smoke. Like the room on the second floor that Hannah always kept locked, and the way conversations stopped when she entered unexpectedly. Most troubling of all was the way Caleb looked at her sometimes, not with desire or ownership, but with something that felt like calculation, as if he were working out a complex problem and she was one of the variables. This morning was different, though. This morning, she was going to get answers. She found him in the barn, mucking out stalls with the methodical efficiency that seemed to characterize everything he did. He'd removed his shirt in the heat, and she could see the full extent of the scars that marked his torso. Old bullet wounds, knife cuts, and something across his ribs that looked like it might have come from a whip. His body told the story of a violent life, and she wondered how many of those scars had names attached to them. "You're up early," he said without looking at her, continuing to fork hay into the stallion's stall. "Couldn't sleep." She leaned against the barn door, watching him work. "Been thinking about what you said that first night, about Jesse not being who I thought he was." Caleb's movements stilled for just a moment before resuming their steady rhythm. "What about it? I want to know the truth, all of it." He set down the pitchfork and turned to face her, those gray eyes searching her face. "You sure about that? Sometimes knowing the truth makes things harder, not easier." "I'm sure." He was quiet for a long moment, and she could see him weighing his words. When he spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "What do you remember about the night Jesse left?" The question caught her off guard. She'd expected him to tell her about Jesse's criminal activities, not ask about their last night together. "He said he had business in El Paso, said he'd be back in a few weeks. And you believed him?" "Why wouldn't I? He'd never lied to me before." The words tasted bitter in her mouth now. "At least, I didn't think he had." "How long had you known him before that night?" "About 2 months. He came through Cedar Falls with a cattle drive. Said he was looking for work. Pa hired him to help repair our roof after the winter storms. She could still remember the way Jesse had smiled at her from the top of the ladder, his dark hair catching the sunlight. He was charming. Said all the right things. I'll bet he did. Caleb picked up a curry brush and began working on the stallion's coat, the repetitive motion seeming to help him think. Tell me about the last conversation you had with him. Maybelle closed her eyes, trying to remember details that had seemed unimportant at the time. We talked about the future, about maybe heading west together, finding a place to settle down. He asked a lot of questions about my family, about Pa's business dealings. What kind of questions? Who he owed money to, where he kept his papers, whether he'd ever had dealings with banks or government men. The memory was clearer now, and she felt a chill run down her spine. I thought he was just trying to understand our situation, but he was gathering information. Caleb's voice was grim. Jesse Kane is what we call a scout. He rides ahead of the main gang, identifies targets, learns their weaknesses, finds ways to get close to people who might be useful. The words hit her like physical blows. You're saying he never cared about me at all? That it was all just a job? I'm saying men like Jesse Kane don't do anything without a reason. The question is what that reason was. Maybelle felt her knees go weak, and she sank down onto a hay bale. Everything she'd believed about those 2 months, the tender words, the stolen kisses, the promises of a future together, all of it had been a lie. But the baby complicates things for everyone. Caleb set down the brush and moved closer, his expression softer than she'd seen it before. That's why you're here, Maybelle. That's why I couldn't let those men take you. I don't understand. He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was heavy with something that might have been regret. My brother Samuel worked for the Territorial Bank in Santa Fe. Smart kid, good with numbers. Thought he could make an honest living in a dishonest world. Last spring, the bank was robbed. 3 men, in and out clean. Knew exactly where to find the safe and how to open it. Sam was the only witness who got a good look at their faces. Understanding began to dawn, cold and terrible. Jesse's gang. They killed the bank manager and 2 guards, but Sam managed to hide. Trouble was, they knew someone had seen them. So they took him. Caleb's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Left a note saying he'd stay alive as long as no one came looking for them. But they also said they'd kill him the moment they felt threatened. And you think Jesse was gathering information about potential threats? About people who might cause trouble for them? I think your father owed money to people who knew people. I think Jesse was supposed to find out how much your pa knew about their operations, whether he might be inclined to talk to the law for the right price. Caleb's gray eyes met hers. But then you told him you were carrying his child, and suddenly the situation got a lot more complicated. Maybelle felt sick. Because now they have leverage over him, a child he doesn't want getting raised by people who might use it against him, or a child they could use to control him if they needed to. Jesse Kane might be a killer and a thief, but even killers and thieves have weaknesses. Having a family makes a man predictable. The implications were staggering. She thought about those last few days with Jesse, how distracted he'd seemed, how quick he'd been to leave. Had he been trying to protect her, or just protecting himself? So you think that's why Morrison and Webb were after me specifically? Not just to add another girl to their stable, but because I'm carrying Jesse's child? I think Morrison's crew has been looking for any advantage they can find. And I think a pregnant girl with connections to both their scout and a potential informant was too valuable to pass up. Then why did you interfere? Why risk yourself for someone you didn't even know? The question hung in the air between them, and Maybelle saw something flicker across Caleb's features. Pain, maybe, or guilt. When he answered, his voice was barely above a whisper. Because I need to find my brother, and you, whether you know it or not, might be the key to doing that. The words settled over her like a cold fog. What do you mean? Jesse's been sending money to someone in Cedar Falls. Regular payments, always delivered by the same Apache runner who brought word about you. We've been watching the drop point for months, trying to figure out who's receiving it and why. And you think it's connected to me? I think Jesse Kane doesn't send money to anyone unless he has a very good reason. And I think your father knew more about Morrison's operations than he'd let on. Caleb's eyes were steady on hers. Your pa ever mention knowing any Apache? Ever have dealings with men from out of territory? Maybelle's mind raced back through years of half-remembered conversations and late-night visitors. There was a man who used to come by sometimes, called himself Rodriguez, but Pa always seemed nervous around him. And there were letters sometimes, delivered by Indian riders. What kind of letters? I don't know. Pa never let me see them, always burned them after reading. But they usually came with money, not much, but enough to keep us fed during the lean times. Caleb was very still, his attention focused on her with laser intensity. When did the letters stop coming? About a month before Jesse showed up. The timing hit her like a physical blow. Oh God, you think Pa was being paid to watch for something? Someone? I think your father was a small-time informant in a much larger game. And I think Jesse was sent to find out what he knew and eliminate any potential problems. Caleb's voice was grim. The question is whether you were supposed to be one of those problems. The barn suddenly felt too small, too warm. Maybelle stood up abruptly, needing air, needing space to think. So everything, my father selling me, those men trying to buy me, even you rescuing me, it's all connected to this gang and whatever they're planning? Everything's connected to finding my brother, Caleb said quietly. But yes, you're caught up in something much bigger than you realized. And you. She turned to face him, anger building in her chest like a hot coal. You didn't save me out of the goodness of your heart. You saved me because you thought I might be useful. I saved you because those men would have killed you once they got what they wanted. Whether you're useful to me or not doesn't change that. But you're hoping I am useful. That's why you brought me here, why you're protecting me. You're betting that Jesse will try to contact me, or that I know something that will help you find your brother. Caleb was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was heavy with something that might have been shame. I'm hoping a lot of things, Maybelle. Most of them probably won't come true. The admission hung between them like a confession. She studied his face, seeing the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the weight he carried in his shoulders. He was a man driven by guilt and grief, willing to use whatever tools came to hand, including her, to achieve his goal. What happens if I can't help you? She asked. What happens if Jesse never tries to contact me, if I don't know anything useful about my father's dealings? Then you stay here as long as you want. Raise your child in safety and build whatever life you can. And you? His smile was bitter as winter wind. Then I keep looking, for as long as it takes. Maybelle looked at this man who'd saved her life for his own reasons, who'd given her sanctuary while harboring his own desperate agenda. She should be angry, she knew, should feel used and manipulated. but all she felt was a deep, aching sadness for both of them. Two people caught in the web of other people's choices, trying to find their way to something that might pass for redemption. "I want to help you find Samuel," she said quietly. Caleb's head snapped up, surprise clear in his gray eyes. "You don't owe me anything." "Maybe not. But I owe myself the truth about what Jesse really was, what my father really knew. And if there's a chance that my child's father is involved in holding an innocent man prisoner." She straightened her shoulders, feeling something shift inside her chest. "Then I need to do whatever I can to make that right." For the first time since she'd met him, Caleb Boone looked uncertain, as if her offer had caught him completely off guard. "It's dangerous," he said finally, "more dangerous than you know. I'm carrying the child of a man who apparently scouts for killers and thieves. I'm pretty sure I've already crossed that line." He studied her face for a long moment, and she had the sense that he was seeing her clearly for the first time, not as a victim to be rescued or a tool to be used, but as a person making her own choice about the path ahead. "All right," he said finally. "But if we're going to do this, we do it my way. No arguments, no second guessing. When I say run, you run. When I say hide, you hide. Your safety and your child's safety come first, always." "Agreed." He nodded once, then moved toward the barn door. "Get some rest. Tomorrow we start planning how to draw Jesse Kane out of hiding." As he walked away, Maybelle placed one hand on her belly, feeling the baby stir restlessly inside her. "Sorry, little one," she whispered. "Looks like your mama's about to make some very dangerous choices." But for the first time since Jesse had ridden out of her life, she felt like she was finally moving towards something instead of just running away, even if she had no idea what that something might cost her. Part 6. The Ghost from the Past. The night air carried the scent of rain on distant mountains and the whisper of wind through canyon walls when Maybelle heard the horses. She'd been sitting on the porch, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion. One hand resting on her belly where the baby had been restless all evening. 6 months along now, and every day brought new aches and changes that reminded her how unprepared she was for what lay ahead. Hannah had gone to bed hours ago, and Caleb was somewhere out in the darkness checking the perimeter, a nightly ritual that spoke of the constant vigilance required to keep sanctuary safe. The valley felt peaceful in the moonlight, almost magical, but Maybelle had learned not to trust the illusion of safety. The sound of hoofbeats was soft at first, barely distinguishable from the night sounds of the desert. But as they grew closer, she could make out the rhythm of a single horse moving at an easy lope, confident and unhurried. Not the desperate gallop of someone fleeing pursuit, but the steady pace of a man who knew exactly where he was going. She should have called out, should have alerted whoever was on watch. Instead, something kept her frozen in place, her heart hammering against her ribs with a recognition she didn't want to acknowledge. The horse and rider emerged from the shadows at the mouth of the canyon like figures from a dream or a nightmare, even in the moonlight, even after all these months. She knew that silhouette, the way he sat his horse with casual grace, the tilt of his hat, the width of his shoulders beneath his coat. Jesse Kane rode into the valley like he owned it, like he belonged there. And for a moment Maybelle felt 17 again, breathless and foolish and desperately in love with a man who'd never existed. He saw her before she could retreat into the house, raising one hand in a gesture that was part greeting, part acknowledgement of surrender. His horse, a different mount than the one she remembered, a sleek black mare that moved like liquid shadow, carried him across the yard with barely a sound. "Hello, Maybelle." His voice was exactly as she remembered, warm honey over steel, with just enough roughness to suggest danger beneath the charm. He swung down from the saddle with fluid grace, tying the mare to the porch rail like he'd done it 100 times before. "Jessie." Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected, though her hands were shaking. "I wondered if you'd ever show up." "Did you?" He stepped onto the porch, and she could see his face clearly for the first time. The months had been kind to him. He looked older, maybe, with new lines around his dark eyes, but still handsome in that careless way that had first caught her attention. Still dangerous in ways she was only beginning to understand. "You look beautiful," he said, his gaze taking in her swollen belly with something that might have been wonder or might have been calculation. "Pregnancy suits you." "Don't." The word came out sharper than she'd intended. "Don't you dare stand there and act like we're old friends catching up. You left me, Jessie. You left me alone and pregnant in a town that treats unmarried mothers like lepers." "I know." There was something in his voice that sounded almost like genuine regret. "I know what I did was wrong, and I know saying I'm sorry doesn't fix anything. But I had reasons, Maybelle. Good reasons." "What reasons could possibly justify abandoning your own child?" Jessie was quiet for a moment, studying her face in the moonlight. When he spoke, his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. "The kind of reasons that keep that child alive. The kind that keep you alive." Before she could ask what he meant, another voice cut through the night air like a blade. "Step away from her, Cain." They both turned to see Caleb emerging from the shadows near the barn, his Colt already in his hand and pointed at Jessie's chest. He moved with that predatory grace she'd come to recognize, closing the distance between them with deadly purpose. Jessie's hands moved slowly away from his sides, showing he was unarmed. "Evening. Boone?" "Been a while." "Not long enough." Caleb's gray eyes never left Jessie's face. "You've got some nerve showing up here. And heard you were keeping my girl safe. Came to thank you for that." "Your girl?" Caleb's voice was deadly quiet. "Far as I can tell, you gave up any claim to her when you rode out and left her to face the consequences alone." Jessie's jaw tightened, but he kept his hands visible and his voice calm. "Things aren't always that simple, aren't they?" Caleb was close enough now that Maybelle could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his finger rested on the trigger. "Why don't you explain it to me? Explain how a man abandons a pregnant woman and then has the gall to call her his girl 6 months later." "Because I was trying to protect her." Jessie's composure cracked for the first time, real emotion bleeding through his careful control. "Because the people I work for don't take kindly to loose ends. And a pregnant woman asking questions about her missing lover draws exactly the kind of attention that gets people killed. So you just disappeared, left her to figure it out on her own?" "I left her because staying would have put a target on her back. Because the kind of men I work for would have used her and the baby to control me. And when they were done with that, they would have killed them both." Jessie's dark eyes found Maybelle's. "I left because I loved you enough to keep you alive, even if it meant you'd hate me for it." The words hit her like physical blows. She wanted to dismiss them, wanted to believe they were just more of his smooth lies. But something in his voice made her pause. "You're saying you left to protect me?" "I'm saying I got word that my crew was planning to use you against me. That they knew about the baby and saw it as leverage." Jessie's attention shifted back to Caleb. "Tell her." "Boone. Tell her what kind of men Morrison and his boys really are." "I've told her plenty," Caleb said, though his gun hadn't wavered. "Question is, what are you really doing here? Because I don't buy that you rode all this way just to check on your abandoned family." Jessie was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made Maybelle's chest tighten with dread. I'm here because Morrison's crew is planning something big, something that's going to put a lot of innocent people in danger. And I'm here because the only way to stop it might be to give them what they really want. Which is? Your brother, Boone. They know you've been looking for Samuel, and they know you'll do anything to get him back. They're planning to use that against you. Caleb went very still, his gray eyes turning winter cold. What do you know about my brother? I know he's alive. I know where they're keeping him. And I know that Morrison's been feeding him just enough hope to keep him cooperative while they use his banking knowledge to plan their next job. Jesse's voice was steady, matter of fact. I also know that job is going to involve robbing the territorial treasury in Santa Fe, and that they plan to kill every witness when they're done. Including Samuel? Including Samuel, unless we give them a reason not to. Maybelle felt the blood drain from her face. What kind of reason? Jesse turned to look at her, and she saw something in his dark eyes that might have been genuine pain. They want assurance that I won't betray them. They want proof that my loyalties lie with the crew, not with... He gestured toward her belly. Not with complications. Understanding hit her like a cold wave. They want you to bring me to them, me and the baby. They want me to prove that I'm willing to sacrifice anything for the crew, even my own child. Jesse's voice was barely above a whisper. And if I don't, if I refuse, they'll kill Samuel and burn down half of Santa Fe just to make their point. Caleb's gun never wavered, but Maybelle could see the conflict in his expression. The desperate need to save his brother warring with his protective instincts toward her. There has to be another way, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Maybe there is. Jesse moved closer, ignoring the gun trained on his chest. Maybe we can make them think they're getting what they want while actually giving them something else entirely. What are you talking about? Caleb demanded. I'm talking about using their own greed against them, making them believe they've won while we set them up for a fall that will destroy them completely. Jesse's eyes were bright with something that might have been hope, or might have been madness. But it would mean taking some serious risks. And it would mean trusting me, even though I know I haven't earned that right. Maybelle looked between the two men, one who'd saved her life for his own reasons, one who'd abandoned her for reasons she was only beginning to understand. Both of them dangerous in their own ways. Both of them asking her to trust them with her life and her child's life. What exactly are you proposing? She asked. Jesse glanced at Caleb, then back at her. I'm proposing we give Morrison exactly what he thinks he wants. We let him believe he's captured the pregnant woman he can use to control me. We let him think he's broken me completely. And then we burn his whole operation to the ground. The plan was insane, reckless, and probably suicidal. It would require her to walk voluntarily into the hands of men who would kill her without hesitation if they suspected deception. It would mean trusting Jesse despite his betrayal, and trusting Caleb despite his hidden agenda. But it might be the only chance to save Samuel Boone and prevent the massacre Morrison was planning in Santa Fe. You'd really do that? She asked Jesse. You'd risk everything to stop them? I've been trying to find a way out of this life for months, he said quietly. Ever since I found out about the baby. Maybe this is my chance to do something right for once. Caleb lowered his gun slightly, though he kept it ready. And if you're lying? If this is all just another con to deliver her to Morrison? Jesse met his gaze steadily. Then you kill me. But you listen to the plan first, and you decide for yourself whether it's worth the risk. Maybelle placed both hands on her belly, feeling the baby stir restlessly as if sensing the tension in the air. 6 months ago, she'd been a naive girl who believed in fairy tale endings. Now she was being asked to make a choice that could save lives or destroy them all. "Tell us the plan," she said quietly. Jesse smiled for the first time since he'd arrived, and for just a moment, she caught a glimpse of the man she'd fallen in love with, the one who might have been real after all. "First," he said, "we're going to need to make Morrison believe that Caleb Boone is finally desperate enough to do something stupid." As Jesse began to outline his scheme, Maybelle realized that whether she wanted it or not, she was about to become the most important piece in a deadly game where the stakes were measured in lives, and she was no longer content to be just a pawn. Part 7. Truth Unveiled. The oil lamp cast dancing shadows across the kitchen table as the three of them sat in tense silence. Jesse's words hanging in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Maybelle could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, could feel the baby moving restlessly as if sensing the danger that surrounded them all. Caleb still held his Colt, though it now rested on the table rather than pointed at Jesse's chest. His gray eyes moved between Jesse and Maybelle, calculating odds and weighing risks with the cold precision of a man who'd made life-or-death decisions before. "Start talking," Caleb said finally. "And this better be good, Kane. Because if I think for 1 second you're lying to us, you'll kill me. I get it." Jesse leaned forward, his hands flat on the table where both of them could see them. "But before I tell you anything else, you both need to understand what we're really dealing with. Morrison's crew isn't just a gang of bank robbers anymore. They've got backing, serious backing from people who want to see the territorial government fall." "What kind of people?" Maybelle asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "The kind who think New Mexico should stay lawless. The kind who make money from chaos and don't want federal marshals or territorial banks interfering with their business." Jesse's voice was grim. "They've been funding Morrison's operations for over a year now, using him to destabilize the region and make statehood look impossible." Caleb's jaw tightened. "And my brother just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time." "Your brother was targeted specifically. They needed someone with inside knowledge of the territorial banking system. Someone who could tell them exactly how to hurt the government where it counts most. In the Treasury." Jesse met Caleb's eyes. "Samuel's been forced to help them plan a robbery that won't just steal money. It'll destroy the territory's financial credibility and set back statehood by decades." The implications were staggering. Maybelle felt sick thinking about Samuel Boone, a man she'd never met, being forced to participate in the destruction of everything he'd worked to build. "How do you know all this?" she asked. Jesse was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight of shame that seemed genuine. "Because I've been Morrison's inside man for over a year. I was supposed to gather intelligence, identify targets, recruit assets." His dark eyes found hers. "Including you." The words hit her like a physical blow, even though she'd suspected as much. "So everything between us was a lie?" "No." The word came out fierce, desperate. "That's what I'm trying to tell you. It started as a job. Yes, I was supposed to get close to your father, find out what he knew about local banking operations, see if he could be useful or if he was a threat." "And was he?" Caleb's voice was deadly quiet. Thomas Carter was a small-time drunk with gambling debts and a loose tongue. He'd been feeding information to various people for years, not out of any political motivation. Just because he needed money for his next bottle or his next bet. Jesse's expression darkened. "But he knew things. About territorial officials who frequented the saloons, about banking schedules, about shipments of federal money." Maybelle felt her stomach turn. "You're saying my father was a spy?" "I'm saying your father was a desperate man who sold information to anyone willing to pay for it. Morrison's people had been using him for months before they sent me to Cedar Falls." Then why did you need to get close to me? Even as she asked the question, she dreaded the answer. Jesse looked down at his hands, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he seemed less than completely confident. Because they wanted to know if Thomas had shared any of that information with his family. If you knew about the payments he was receiving. If you'd overheard conversations that could be problematic. So you seduced me to find out if I was a security risk. The words tasted like ash in her mouth. That was the plan. Jesse's voice was barely above a whisper. Get close to you, learn what you knew, report back to Morrison. If you were innocent, I'd disappear and that would be the end of it. If you were a threat, you would have killed me. It wasn't a question. Jesse's silence was answer enough. Caleb's gun was back in his hand faster than thought. The barrel pressed against Jesse's temple before he could blink. Give me one reason not to pull this trigger right now. Because I didn't do it. Jesse didn't flinch away from the gun, didn't even seem to breathe. Because somewhere along the way, the job became real. You became real, Maybelle. What I felt for you, what we had together, that was never part of the plan. Pretty words, Caleb snarled. But you still left her, still abandoned her when she needed you most. I left because I found out what Morrison really had planned for her. Jesse's eyes locked on Maybelle's, desperate and pleading. The night before I disappeared, I got word that the job had changed. Morrison didn't just want information anymore, he wanted leverage. He wanted a way to control any territorial officials who might cause problems. Understanding dawned cold and terrible. He wanted to use me as bait, to compromise territorial officials through scandal or blackmail. Worse than that, he wanted to make you available to certain influential men who had particular tastes. Men who would pay handsomely for the privilege and who would be completely compromised afterward. Jesse's voice cracked with something that sounded like real anguish. When I realized what they intended, when I understood that they planned to use you until you broke and then dispose of you, you ran. Caleb's voice was flat. Instead of warning her, instead of protecting her, you just ran. I ran because staying would have gotten us both killed. Jesse's composure finally shattered. You think I could have taken on Morrison's entire crew? You think I could have protected her against men who specialize in making people disappear? You could have tried. I did try. I sent word to contacts I had, people who might be able to help. I arranged for Apache runners to keep watch on Cedar Falls, to report if anyone threatened her. Jesse's eyes found Maybelle's again. I never stopped watching out for you, even from a distance. Then why didn't you come back when you learned about Morrison and Webb trying to buy me? She demanded. Because I was 300 miles away when it happened. And by the time I got word, you were already gone. Jesse glanced at Caleb. Good thing, too. Because if those men had succeeded in taking you to redemption, you'd have been dead within a week. Caleb slowly lowered his gun, though he kept it ready. So what's changed? Why are you here now? Because Morrison's getting desperate. The territorial treasury job is supposed to happen in 2 weeks. And he's starting to eliminate anyone who might pose a threat to the operation. Jesse's voice was grim. Including me. Including Samuel. Including anyone who knows too much about the plan. And he knows about the baby? Maybelle asked. He knows about the baby, and more importantly, he knows that having a child makes me vulnerable, makes me controllable. He's been planning to use that against me when the time comes. Caleb leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. So what's the play? What do you think we can do against an organization that size? Jesse pulled a folded paper from his jacket and spread it on the table. It was a hand-drawn map, detailed and precise, showing what looked like a camp nestled in a canyon somewhere in the mountains. This is where they're holding Samuel. It's also where they're planning the final details of the treasury job. He pointed to various features on the map. 15 men, maybe 20, plus whatever territorial officials they've managed to compromise. They think they're untouchable up there. How do you know all this? Because I drew this map. Because I've been there. Jesse met Caleb's eyes. Morrison thinks I'm completely loyal. Thinks he owns me through the baby. He's been letting me in on the planning, trusting me with information he wouldn't share with anyone else. Maybelle studied the map, seeing the defensive positions, the limited approaches, the careful planning that had gone into choosing this location. It looks impregnable. It is if you try to attack it head-on. But Morrison has one weakness, his greed. He wants that treasury job more than anything, and he's convinced that having me under his control is the key to pulling it off. Jesse traced a finger along one of the canyon approaches. If we can make him believe that he's finally broken me completely, that I'm willing to bring you to him as proof of my loyalty, he'll let his guard down, Caleb finished. He'll think he's won. Exactly. And while he's celebrating his victory, while he's focused on gloating over his leverage. Jesse's smile was cold as winter. That's when we burn it all down. Maybelle looked between the two men, seeing the dangerous gleam in their eyes, the way they were already beginning to plan violence and death. And what happens to me in this plan? What happens to my baby? Both men looked at her, and she saw something in their expressions that made her blood run cold. The look of men who were willing to sacrifice anything to achieve their goals. You'd be the bait, Jesse said quietly. The proof of my broken loyalty that gets me close enough to free Samuel and eliminate Morrison's crew. You're asking me to walk into a camp full of killers and trust that you can get me out alive. I'm asking you to help us stop men who will kill hundreds of innocent people if they're allowed to succeed. Jesse's voice was steady, but she could see the desperation in his dark eyes. I'm asking you to give me a chance to do one thing right in my life, and if something goes wrong, if your plan doesn't work. Jesse was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. Then I'll make sure you and the baby don't suffer. I promise you that. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and Maybelle realized that she was being asked to gamble not just her own life, but the life of her unborn child, on the word of a man who'd already betrayed her once. She looked at Caleb, seeing the conflict in his gray eyes, his need to save his brother warring with his protective instincts toward her. What do you think? She asked him. Caleb was quiet for a long time, studying the map, weighing options and possibilities. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with the weight of command. I think it's the most dangerous thing any of us could possibly do, he said. I also think it might be our only chance to stop a massacre and save an innocent man. And if I say no, then we find another way, even if it takes longer, even if the odds are worse. Maybelle placed her hands on her belly, feeling the baby stir as if responding to her touch. 6 months ago, she'd been a girl who believed the world was fundamentally good, that people were basically decent, that love could conquer anything. Now she was being asked to choose between her own safety and the lives of strangers, between the certainty of her child's protection and the possibility of preventing a catastrophe. When do we leave? She asked quietly. Jesse's face showed surprise and something that might have been relief. You'll do it? I'll do it, but I have conditions. Name them. First, you tell me everything. No more secrets, no more lies, no more protecting me from the truth. If I'm risking my life and my child's life, I have the right to know exactly what we're walking into. Agreed. Second, if something goes wrong, if the plan fails, You don't make decisions about my life for me. If I'm going to die, it'll be my choice, not yours." Jessie nodded slowly. "Agreed." She turned to Caleb. "And you, when this is over, when Samuel is safe and Morrison is dealt with, you let me go. No more rules about staying in the valley. No more protection I didn't ask for. I make my own choices about where to go and how to live." Caleb's expression was unreadable. "Even if those choices put you in danger?" "Even then." He was quiet for a moment, then nodded once. "Agreed." Maybelle looked down at the map, at the canyon that might become her grave, at the plan that could save lives or destroy them all. Then she looked up at the two men who were asking her to trust them with everything she had left. "All right then," she said. "Let's go save Samuel Boone and burn Morrison's operation to the ground." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and carrying with it the scent of distant storms. And somewhere in the darkness, fate began to gather itself like thunder on the horizon. Part 8. The Mother's Decision. Dawn came too soon and not soon enough, painting the canyon walls in shades of rose and gold while Maybelle sat on the porch steps, her hands resting on her belly as she felt the baby's restless movements. Today was the day they would ride into Morrison's camp, and she was surprised to find that fear had given way to something harder, more resolute, the calm that comes when all the choices have been made and only action remains. Hannah emerged from the house carrying a cup of coffee and a thick shawl, settling beside Maybelle with the careful movements of someone who understood that this might be their last quiet moment together. "You don't have to do this, child," Hannah said quietly, wrapping the shawl around Maybelle's shoulders against the morning chill. "There's still time to change your mind." "No, there isn't." Maybelle accepted the coffee gratefully, inhaling the steam that rose from the cup like incense. "Too many people will die if Morrison succeeds. I can't live with that on my conscience." "And if you die instead, what about your baby's conscience then?" It was a fair question, one that had kept Maybelle awake most of the night. "I keep thinking about Samuel Boone, how he must feel, being forced to help plan something that goes against everything he believes in. How many other innocent people are caught up in Morrison's web, being used against their will? That's not your responsibility, isn't it?" Maybelle turned to look at the older woman, seeing the worry lines etched deep around her kind eyes. "This baby I'm carrying, its father is part of this. Whether Jesse's telling the truth about his change of heart or not, my child is connected to these men, to their crimes. Maybe this is my chance to break that connection, to give my baby a clean start." Hannah was quiet for a moment, studying Maybelle's face in the morning light. "You've changed," she said finally. "When Caleb first brought you here, you were still a girl, scared, broken, looking for someone else to make your decisions for you. Now I'm a woman about to become a mother, and mothers do what they have to do to protect their children, even if it means walking into hell itself." The sound of horses approaching made them both look up. Caleb and Jesse rode out of the morning mist like warriors from some ancient legend, their faces grim with purpose and their weapons clearly visible. Behind them came two Apache riders, men Maybelle had seen before but never spoken to, their faces painted for war. Caleb dismounted and approached the porch, his gray eyes taking in every detail of her appearance with the calculating gaze of a general reviewing his troops. "You ready for this?" "As ready as I'll ever be." She stood slowly, feeling the weight of the baby and the weight of the decision she'd made. "What's the plan once we reach Morrison's camp?" Jesse swung down from his horse, his dark eyes haunted by something that might have been guilt or fear. "I ride in first, alone, with news that I've captured you." Tell Morrison that I found you at Boone's hideout and decided to prove my loyalty by bringing you in. And Caleb? It follows at a distance with our Apache friends here. When the shooting starts, they'll create a diversion while I get you and Samuel out of the camp. Maybelle looked between the two men, seeing the careful way they avoided each other's eyes, the tension that spoke of old grudges and new distrust. What aren't you telling me? Caleb and Jesse exchanged a look that lasted just a heartbeat too long. Morrison's paranoid, Jesse said finally. He doesn't trust anyone completely, not even me. There's a good chance he'll want to verify my story before he accepts it. You verify how? By testing my loyalty, making me prove that I value the crew's success more than anything else. Jesse's voice was carefully neutral, but she could see the storm in his dark eyes. Including you and the baby, understanding hit her like a cold wave. He'll want you to hurt me, to prove that I mean nothing to you. Or worse. The words hung in the air between them, and Maybelle felt something shift inside her chest. Not fear, but a cold fury that burned like ice. Let me understand this correctly. Your plan involves taking me into a camp full of killers, where I'll be at the mercy of men who view women as disposable property, and then hoping you can fake your way through whatever sick tests they devise? That's about the size of it, Caleb said grimly. It's why I think we should find another way. There is no other way. Jesse's composure cracked for the first time that morning. Morrison's moving the Treasury job up. It's happening in 3 days instead of 2 weeks. If we don't act now, if we don't take this chance, hundreds of people will die and Samuel will be executed as a co-conspirator. And you're willing to sacrifice Maybelle and her baby to prevent that? I'm willing to do whatever it takes to stop Morrison, just like you. The accusation hung heavy in the morning air, and Maybelle saw truth in it that neither man wanted to acknowledge. They were both willing to use her, to risk her life for their own purposes, even if those purposes were noble. Enough. Her voice cut through their argument like a blade. Both of you, stop talking about me like I'm not here. Stop making plans for my life without consulting me. She stood up, feeling the baby stir as if responding to her rising anger, and walked down the porch steps to stand between the two men. You want to know what I think? I think you're both so focused on your own guilt and your own need for redemption that you've forgotten something important. What's that? Caleb asked. I'm not the same helpless girl you rescued from that saloon. I'm not a victim anymore, and I'm not a pawn in your game. She looked at Jesse, seeing surprise flicker across his features. You think Morrison will test your loyalty by asking you to hurt me? Fine. Then we make sure you pass that test. You... Maybelle, what are you saying? I'm saying we give Morrison exactly what he expects to see. A broken woman, completely under your control, too terrified to cause trouble. Her voice was steady, matter of fact. I'm saying we make him believe that you've already done whatever it takes to ensure my compliance. Jesse's face went pale. I can't ask you to... You're not asking, I'm telling you. If selling that performance means we can get close enough to free Samuel and stop the Treasury robbery, then that's what we do. The risks are mine to take. She turned to Caleb, seeing conflict warring in his gray eyes. You said yesterday that when this is over, you'd let me make my own choices about my life. Well, this is my choice. I'm choosing to walk into that camp with my eyes wide open, knowing exactly what might happen, because it's the right thing to do. One of the Apache riders spoke in his own language, the words flowing like water over stone. Jesse nodded and replied in the same tongue, then turned back to them. Running Wolf says the morning wind is favorable. If we're going to do this, we need to move now, while we still have the advantage of surprise. Maybelle felt the baby kick hard against her ribs, as if protesting the danger she was about to face. She placed both hands on her belly, whispering a silent promise. "I'm going to give you the best chance I can, little one, even if it means taking some risks now." Hannah appeared at her elbow with a traveling bag. "Food, clean clothes, and a few other things you might need," she said quietly. Then, even more quietly, "There's a derringer in the bottom, wrapped in cloth, small enough to hide, but it'll stop a man if you need it to." "Hannah, I can't." "You can and you will. A mother's first duty is to protect her child, by whatever means necessary." The older woman's brown eyes were fierce with protective love. "Don't you dare hesitate to use it if things go wrong." Maybelle hugged Hannah tightly, breathing in the scent of flower and herbs that always clung to her. "Thank you for everything. Come back to us, child. Come back safe." Jesse helped her onto his horse, settling her in front of him with the same careful attention he'd shown months ago when they'd ridden together through the hills around Cedar Falls. But this time, there was no pretense of romance, no illusion of a future together. This time they were allies in a desperate gamble, nothing more. Caleb mounted his own horse, checking his weapons one final time. "If this goes wrong—" "It won't," Maybelle said with more confidence than she felt. "We won't let it." They rode out of the hidden valley as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the desert floor. Behind them, Sanctuary faded into the morning haze like a dream, while ahead lay Morrison's Canyon and the most dangerous performance of Maybelle's life. As they traveled, Jesse spoke quietly in her ear, coaching her on what to expect, how to react, what signs to watch for. But Maybelle found her attention drifting to the life growing inside her, to the future she was fighting to secure. "What will you name the baby?" Jesse asked during one of their brief rest stops. The question caught her off guard. "I don't know. I haven't really thought about it. If it's a boy, maybe Samuel, after Caleb's brother." She glanced at the grim-faced man riding beside them. "Assuming we get him out alive. And if it's a girl?" Maybelle was quiet for a moment, thinking about her mother, about Hannah, about all the women who'd shown her what strength looked like. "Hope," she said finally. "I think I'd name her Hope." Jesse nodded slowly. "That's a good name, a name worth fighting for." As they crested the final ridge before Morrison's Canyon, Maybelle felt the baby settle into stillness, as if even the unborn child understood that they were entering dangerous territory. Below them, smoke rose from cooking fires, and she could see the shapes of men moving about their business, unaware that their destruction was riding toward them. "Remember," Jesse said, his voice barely above a whisper, "no matter what happens down there, no matter what you see or hear, you trust the plan, you play your part, and you wait for my signal. And if you don't give a signal, if something happens to you, then you run. You get yourself and that baby as far away as possible, and you don't look back." Maybelle touched the hidden derringer through the fabric of her skirt, feeling its small weight like a promise. "I understand." As they began the descent into the canyon, she closed her eyes and whispered one last prayer, not for her own safety, but for the strength to do what needed to be done, whatever the cost. The game was about to begin, and this time, Maybelle Carter was going to play to win, even if winning meant losing everything she'd ever thought she wanted from life. The baby stirred one more time, and she took it as a sign of approval from the new life she carried, a life that deserved to be born into a world free from the shadows of Morrison's crimes. Whatever happened in the canyon below, she would make sure that world existed, or die trying.